Listener, you are in for a treat today. The episode that's coming up is quite different. It's a diversion from our normal topics, from our normal length. So, this is a long walk. You should strap on your camelback for this one if you're walking in the heat for sure. But I felt that the story was worth honoring. And my good friend, Terry Jordan, is here to talk about her personal story and her story of her daughter, actually. And this is not just all about triathlon training. So it is about really a story of resilience and of heart, light, and energy. And I won't say more. I think you'll come to your own conclusions. I hope feel lifted and lighter after listening to it as I did, just being able to witness the story and chat with Terry a little bit more. So you'll definitely want to go to the show notes after this one, and that'll be at flipping50.com/triathlon training. And check out the resources, learn a little bit more about Terry if you're so inclined. And before we dive in, this episode is brought to you by the Flipping 50 Fitness Specialist. It's a menopause fitness specialist course for those trainers and health coaches, yoga instructors, Pilates instructors, and fitness instructors who are working with women in midlife who want to get them better results. Understand what to do with signs and symptoms or with lab results, and how to interpret that and modify or create exercise prescriptions that honor the female in the moment that she's in the moment, helping her get better results, not just simply be more tired or potentially getting worse results. I'm going to put the link to that in the show notes, and it'll be flipping50.com/specialist if you have a mind like a steel trap. All right, let's dive into this episode. My guest today is Terry Jordan. She's a Reiki Master, yoga instructor, massage therapist, writer, singer, and multiple Ironman triathlon finishers. We're going to break down what that is for those of you who are foreign to that word. And she's got impossibly slow times in her own words. She says this. She's married to Bob Jordan, a world champion Ironman singer, songwriter, mom, a couple truly heavenly angels, Emily and Thomas, as well as an amazing singer, songwriting son, Timothy. We live in Oregon and recently adopted Tucker, a sweet 2-year-old from the Basset Hound Rescue of Southern California. Terry, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So as you can tell, listeners, Terry fits right in. She's got this long list of holistic energy sources and totally a giver and very much artistic. I can tell from that. But then there's the Ironman thing. So we've got this right brain, left brain thing going on, which is very fun. So just to refresh your memory, many of you listeners who've been here for a while have probably rolled your eyes to think she's talking about Ironman again, but it's true. We are. So Ironman is kind of the longest of the long in terms of triathlons. And it involves a 2.4, usually open water swim. So there is no line on the bottom of the pool to be spotting. And there's often waves. And then that's followed by a 112-mile bike ride, which is then followed by the last loop, which is a 26.2-mile run, which, yes, is a marathon to those of you who know that distance. They give you 17 hours to complete it, and there have been races where I've taken every one of those minutes. So there is that. I imagine Terry, based on the intro, and I have a lot in common. So we get our money's worth out of those registration fees. So Terry, I really want to talk a little bit about, to our listeners, why in the heck we're talking about endurance training and triathlon training here, because many of our listeners know that's actually the antichrist of hormone balancing exercise. And so we rarely encourage that here. In fact, I point myself out as please don't do this, right? Don't do this at home. Don't do it traveling. But there is that thing. So, those of you who are listening who are lovers of endurance exercise and have to hold yourself back not to do it in order to support your own hormone balance, you're going to feel right at home today with me talking to Terry. But she's also got me all fired up that I probably will need to blame her if I register again for one of these and let the world watch it. So, Terry, first talk about, I mean, somebody doesn't accidentally register for an Ironman. How did you stumble into that?
Well, it happened many years ago, back in the late 80s. I was riding my bike, and it was a long ride. It started in Seattle and it ended in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And
Jeez, I
on this
guess.
really long ride, it took 6.5 weeks. And on that ride, there was several days where there were 100 miles. And one of them in particular, I saw one of the people on the ride about 10 miles from our finish that day. And when I got into camp, I went up to her and I'm like, what the heck were you doing? Because we had already ridden 100 miles and she was at least 10 miles away. So she had probably done a 20-mile run. And I'm like, what are you doing? She goes, oh, cycling really doesn't do it for me. I really need to get more exercise. So I just went out for a little run. I'm like, no, that was like a 20-mile run. So later I found out she was a triathlete. I'm like, what is a triathlete? Like, what are we talking about here? And I started learning as I was riding across the country because I knew I wasn't going to do another cross country trip, but I knew I wanted to do something after this. And started finding out about triathlon, what it was. She was a world-class triathlete, this person that was riding her bike across the country. And I found out that it was a swim, bike, run in that order. And I wanted to learn more. And I was really stuck on the transitions. I like, how do you swim, get out of the water, and then get on a bike? Like, what do you do in that first transition? And then how do you get off your bike and start running? So it probably, I have to say, spent, maybe 1,000 miles of cycling, wondering how do they do the transitions, and then I couldn't wait to find out. So after the bike ride, probably like a year later, somebody on that bike trip gave my name to a friend. So this is a random, like a double blind, you do double blind studies at random. My friend said her name was Ellie, gave my number, my phone number to her friend, Sue, whose husband's friend did triathlons. So this guy, a total stranger, he left a message on my machine. Hi, this is Bob Jordan, a total stranger. I got your number from a friend named Sue. And we got talking on the phone. This is in the days before Facebook, or, I didn't know what he looked like, nothing. All I knew is that this guy had SARK bars, SARK. You probably never heard of them. But at the time, there was this guy that made these extension bars on his bike. And so you could lean forward, and I think they call them aero bars now, but you could lean forward, and I would have given anything to have SARK bars on that long ride across the country. And I'm like, you have SARK bars? Like, Bob had SARK bars. And I'm like, oh my gosh, could I try your bike? Like, I couldn't believe that I'm talking to somebody who actually has them on his bike. And he said, well, I actually have these special pedals, and, you kind of clip in, and I'm like, look pedals? And this is a long time ago. This is like 1988. And he goes, I have look pedals, and I said, I have look pedals. He goes, you have look pedals? So now we're like geeking out on bike stuff. And our first date was a triathlon. It was Bob Jordan picking me up at 6 o'clock in the morning, dark, pouring rain, Massachusetts. And so the first time I ever laid eyes on this man was opening the door to my house to see him standing there in the rain. And he took me to this triathlon that he was doing. And I have to say, I fell in love that day with the sport and the man. And that was July 24th, 1988. There's a lot more to that story, but that's how it began. And Bob and I have been doing these ever since. A lot more Bob. I have done, several Ironman distance triathlons, but I look at Bob, he is honestly like Superman. I look at him and I say, I could never do that. I could never do a triathlon, or at that distance, it's just impossible. And then years later, after we had been married, I've done other shorter distance. There's an Olympic distance, which I'm actually training for an Olympic distance right now. It's about a 1 mile swim, 25-mile bike, and a 10K, which is a 6.2 mile run. And that feels really doable to me. And getting back, I haven't been doing triathlons for a while, so that feels good. But getting back to after Bob and I had been married, we had our first child, Emily, was born. He was doing triathlons, even I think Emily was maybe 3 weeks old, and he did an Ironman in Maryland. We had this infant, so he's just been doing these since 1989. Bob has been doing Ironman distance races since 1989. It includes our honeymoon, by the way. Our honeymoon included an Ironman. Anyway, yeah, it's really a very much a part of our life. Bob will say, "That's cool, right?"
So let me get this right. Do I understand that your first triathlon was an Ironman?
My first one, where I was raising funds for my first marathon, included a triathlon. My first Ironman included a marathon, and that was my first marathon. But my first triathlon, the shorter distances, was like an Olympic distance one that I had just mentioned. Those distances, yeah.
So you did build your way up.
Yes, I did, but I had taken a lot of time off, having children and not training at all until we. So here's what got me back into it. It was this amazing group of folks in Northern California, and just to back up a little bit. Bob had always wanted to get into the Hawaii Ironman. The distances are the same. What you mentioned at the beginning there, Deborah, the 2.4 mile open water swim, 112-mile bike, 26.2 mile run. Those distances are the same, but there are places, and one in particular, the World Championship for the Hawaii, in Hawaii, is for the people who are the pros, as well as those who win their age group at other Ironman races around the world. So every October, there is a world championship. It's the same distances. It's in Hawaii. But when that first started many years ago, when Ironman Hawaii started, they made a promise to let ordinary people do that race. And so they kept about 10% of the field for so-called ordinary people that would do an Ironman, right? But these are the ordinary people that didn't qualify, and they got in by lottery. So they wrote and submitted, this application. And year after year after year, Bob submitted to get into the Hawaii Ironman, the one in Kona. Because if you hear, and at least in those days, back in the 80s and 90s, if somebody said you did an Ironman, they said Hawaii, because it's kind of like, oh, you did a marathon. Did you do Boston? It's that kind of it's the same 26.2 miles, but did you do Boston? 26.2 is still 20, but anyway, it's kind of like that. Or did you do New York? Did you do one of the big ones? No, they're all big.
Right.
But anyway, getting back to the Hawaii Ironman, the Holy Grail, so to speak, there is something about being surrounded by world class athletes. These folks not only in their age group that won, but also the incredible pros that finished this race in 8 hours, sometimes less, at Cozumel. The same day Ironman Arizona was held this year, November 21st, someone in Cozumel won the race in 7 hours and 20 minutes, which is a world record. No one has ever, anywhere in the world gone that fast. So it's amazing what's happening, that people are going faster and faster. But as you said at the beginning, they give you 17 hours, and I like to get the full, my full money's worth. It's kind of like a credit card. That's a limit, not a goal. They do limit you at 17 hours. My first Ironman, and I'll get back to how I got into that one. But the first one I finished in 16 hours, 57 minutes, and 44 seconds.
Wow.
I know, I had 2 minutes and 15 seconds to spare, which I felt at the time was plenty of time. And I couldn't understand why Bob was pushing me so hard at the end. Like, look, I looked up at, like, honey, look, I still have 2 minutes. Anyway, we just kind of getting to how I got into it. We had a daughter, Emily, who at the age of 4 got diagnosed with leukemia. It came out of the blue. It was acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctor thought it was a cold. It turned out to be not a cold. They thought maybe strep. No, it wasn't strep. And when they did the blood test and saw her white blood cell count at the time of diagnosis was 970,000. And generally a white blood cell count is like 10 to 15,000. They said they'd never seen a count that high. She was, if she hadn't gone into the hospital like right that moment, may not have lived through the night. It became this incredible emergency, from having just child checkups and everything fine to emergency, ambulance from one hospital that didn't even have the machinery to handle this big procedure they had to do, pull out all her white blood cells right away. I mean, they thought that she would have a stroke, or her kidneys would fail, or she wouldn't be able to survive. Her blood was so thick with these immature white blood cells that had just totally overtaken her tiny little 4-year-old body. Anyway, she had treatment. It went on and on. Her prognosis wasn't good from the start, but there was a lot of chemo, a lot of radiation. And then at one point, it looked like she had a relapse. And so they decided to do a stem cell transplant. And by this point, she is 5 years old. She actually turned 5.5 in the hospital. And by that time, Timothy was born. You had mentioned Thomas, and I really appreciated that. I forgot that I wrote that in my little bio there. But we lost a child, Thomas, and just after Thomas died, he died full term. Emily was diagnosed with leukemia, and then while she was going through the throes of leukemia, I became pregnant with Timothy. When Timothy was born, we went into the hospital with Emily for her transplant. So at that time, Timothy was 6 weeks old. So he is our virtual only child. He's the one who's still here on Earth and making music, and just an incredibly great guy. But so now we're talking, this is 24 years ago, 1997. Emily is in the hospital. I have Timothy as a newborn. And Bob and I are trading where he spends the night in the hospital, because they said they didn't want Timothy as an infant sleeping overnight in the hospital room of her transplant unit. So the deal was that I would stay in an apartment. We had to move to Los Angeles. This was UCLA Medical Center. We moved up to LA. I stayed in the apartment at night. Bob stayed at the hospital with Emily. And then in the morning, we did a trade-off where I came into the hospital room with Timothy, which totally brightened up Emily's day. Her whole countenance changed. She was just like, Timothy. Oh, hi, Mom. Timothy. And she'd hold her arms out, and I would just bring this little tiny infant bundle into her bed and plop her next to, him next to her. And she would surround him with Barbies and all her toys, just like such a scene of joy, seeing her getting to have her little brother in bed, and just that was really a highlight. And there was a big calendar on the wall, a gigantic wishbone calendar. I don't know if you know this little dog. There was a show about a little dog with a big imagination, and he'd go on all these little adventures. Anyway, she loved Wishbone. So the Wishbone calendar's on the wall, January, February, March, April. When it switches to April, Bob had written on her calendar, he put a big circle around the number 24 with all these arrows going towards it. And basically, that was his birthday. So it totally switched the scene from being in a hospital room where Emily's having a transplant and things are not looking good. The kind of ups and downs of being in this isolation room, and months going by. So we didn't know that he had circled his birthday and made it all about him, but that's so Bob, So anyway, Bob comes, we're doing the trade, he is coming in, and Emily asks, Daddy, what do you want for your birthday? Because obviously he made it, let us know. And he said, well, honey, I want you to get well and come home with me and Mom and Timothy. And she goes, I know, but I mean, what do you want for a present? He said, well, Em, I want to get into Hawaii. So the Hawaii Ironman, he had applied by lottery. It was his 10th try. She watched him do this year after year in his lemming-like approach to get into the coveted Ironman. He had done other Ironman races, but not the Holy Grail. So she had this idea of how I have to get Daddy into Ironman. Like that was the birthday present. And suddenly we knew what to do. Like I said, well, why don't we, just write a letter? I'm going to write a letter. And then suddenly I knew, oh my gosh, of course the letter has to come from Emily. And so I sat by her bed and we composed this letter. And dear lottery people, my name is Emily. I'm 5 years old. I'm having a transplant to get rid of my leukemia. I can't leave my isolation room to get my dad a present. His birthday's coming up. Maybe if I write you a letter, you will pick him. I'm just paraphrasing. I can't remember all of the words, but it just went on and on. Maybe you'll pick my dad. If you pick my dad, you'll make a great choice because he'll be smiling the whole day. It will be his big dream come true. And then at the end, don't tell him. It would be a surprise. My mom helped me write this letter. It's just, and she said, thank you, love, Emily. And she wrote her name, Emil, and then the Y, the bottom of the Y came around her whole name, like around the E, all the way around back to the Y, like a big, gigantic circle. I was like, Emily, why do you do that with your Ys? And she goes, oh, that's a big hug. She's just so sweet. Anyway, that letter went in the mail and off to the lottery people, and with her address as a, return address was a UCLA Medical Center in her hospital room and the phone number in her room, because in those days they had phones with actually attached to walls and stuff. And
true.
Yeah, so anyway, I don't know what that sound was. Sorry. I think that was on my end. And so that was on April 9th, Bob's birthday, April 24th. And then Emily got very, very sick. She just, the transplant, which was doing really well, it was a stem cell transplant, started, new white blood cells were forming. This was good. And the stem cell goes into the bone marrow. So then it becomes, you want a little bit of what they call graft versus host disease. Kind of like if you have a transplant an organ, like sometimes the body will reject the organ, but this is the blood. It's going right into the blood, and you want the blood, this kind of new cells, to do a little bit of this, attacking what they're, because you want it to be alive and active, but not too much. And it looked like it was doing a little bit too much graft versus host disease, really attacking her organs and her whole body. And so things started shifting. And as she was getting sicker, just like a week later, so now it's just like right before Bob's birthday, there's a call into her room. I happened to be the one to pick up the phone. They said, is this Emily Jordan's room? I said, yes. And is Emily there? And I'm like, yes. So I, hold the phone up to Emily. She can't talk. Her mouth is filled with sores, and she had a little thing where she gave herself morphine. I mean, they gave it to us up to a certain amount, but she had a little thumb press that she could, when her pain was too much, she could give herself a little bit. And she just like shook her head, like, I can't talk, Mom. You know what I mean? She had kind of reverted to signing and pointing and all. So I said, she can't talk right now. Then they said, well, did she, we got a letter from her. Is this her mom? And I'm like, yes. And well, we want to let her know that we picked her dad for the Ironman.
Wow.
It was just like, I said, oh my God, Emily, they picked dad. And she just like did her thumb up, you know what I mean? And said, we have to keep this a surprise, because they wanted to bring the lottery selection, the whole, wanted to make it a thing in her hospital room. But of course, I had to get permission and all this other stuff. But I asked her to keep it a secret. It wasn't too hard because she was having a hard time talking. However, when Bob came to the room that day, when we were doing the changing of the guard kind of thing, and he was going to stay the night, she said, Daddy, we got you a present. And I looked at her like, what? No, don't tell. And then, of course, I was leaving. So she was going to be there all night with him.
Oh, no.
Right? I'm like, oh, no. Like, how can a 5-year-old keep a secret? Oh, that would be impossible. And so I'm just like looking at her, my eyes, how you can make your eyes really
big. Oh, yeah.
Don't, no, remember, surprise. So he goes, oh, he starts guessing, right? Oh, is it really cute and kind of brown and white and tan and has really long ears? And she's like, no, it's not a Basset Hound. So he's guessing because he loves Basset Hounds, and guessing one thing after another. And she's like, Daddy, it's a surprise. And that was it. And I just looked at her like behind Bob. I'm like giving her like this little prayer hands, like and little thumbs up, like, good. Remember, it's a secret. So night after night, Bob is there with Emily day after day. I'm there with Emily. Oh my gosh. And then, but she was getting sicker. The transplant really was turning on her. It seemed like attacking her, and they were trying everything, steroids. Her belly got really, really big. It looked like she was pregnant, which was so ironic because she had been given so much, radiation, and that they had already had us sign forms that she would be sterile. Like, we had to agree bit by bit that, because of this cranial radiation, she's going to lose some cognitive development. Because of this radiation, she's going to lose some height. And I said, well, are we talking inches? They said, no, probably over a foot, because it's too, it's going to affect her pituitary gland, and on, signing. Anyway, we, had agreed, and her belly was so big, it looked like she was pregnant. And as I'm rubbing her belly, because that helped her to feel better, I was thinking like, oh my gosh, this is how your belly would be, if you were ever to get pregnant. And it was just a mom moment, you know what I mean? Of me feeling sorry for myself that I had taken that away from her, you know what I mean? Anyway, we had this meeting. The doctors called a meeting, and it was a really intense meeting. One of those, can you come into this room? And it was a very cramped room, like, more like storage and supply room. And they pulled in some chairs, and obviously not set up for this kind of meeting. You know what I mean? Just the four of us, a doctor and the transplant unit, and two doctors, and Bob and I. And they said, things are not looking good. We're going to take her into the intensive care unit. They have an isolation room inside the intensive care unit, a very tiny room. And they said that we wouldn't be able to take Timothy in. We wouldn't be able to stay there overnight. We could come anytime we wanted, but we couldn't bring Timothy. And they were going to do what they called a drug-induced paralysis. So basically, put her on a respirator to help her, because she was having a hard time. Her belly was so big that it hurt to breathe. So she was kind of sitting upright, making these very shallow breaths. And they said, if there's anything you want to talk to her about, now would be the time, because when kids are this sick, most times they're not able to come off the respirator. So it was one of those meetings,
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And it was April 18th. So Bob looked at me and he goes, I was there. I got to spend a lot of hours today. If you want to go in there, honey, why don't you go and talk to her? And I'm a mom, and I'm like, she's a little girl, right? Just tell her a story. I'm thinking I need a story. Just kind of make up a story. And I had talked to a friend earlier that day. I said, I need a story, a good story of one that is going to let her know that she's going to go and have this procedure, but she's going to be fine and she's going to be back in her room, but it's only for a little bit. They're going to help her. And, the story. So we're there was no story to tell. I was looking for something that was written that I could just share, but there wasn't a story. And she said, well, this is my friend Lauren. She's like, well, what do you do during the day? And I said, I always go through a park on the way to the hospital. It's a beautiful, just flowers, and there's a little stream, and we just started talking. She goes, tell her about that. Tell her about, what you do as you go through. And I was thinking about all the little things in there. And so Lauren said, well, caterpillars become butterflies. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's a story. Okay. So I go into the room and I said, Emily, you want to hear a story? And she nodded. Of course, that's all she ever wanted to do. And I sat by her bed and I said, once upon a time, there was a little caterpillar named Sally. Sally was really hungry and she started to eat. She ate and she ate and she ate so much that her belly got big, just like yours is right now. And she started to rub her belly with her legs. Sally had a lot of legs, and she smiled. And I started rubbing her belly as I was telling her the story. She rubbed and she rubbed until one day she noticed some light coming through. It was her eyes. Oh, there was another part. She was rubbing her belly, and it was making her feel better, but it was still hard to breathe. So she wrapped herself up in her favorite yellow blanket and she drifted off to sleep. Just then, Emily reached for her blanket, to find it. And I kept with the story, and she slept until one day she noticed some light coming through. It was her eyes. She was waking up. The first thing she did was look for her yellow blanket. It was gone. She had become a beautiful butterfly. Well, as soon as I told the story, and I haven't told it in a long time, so I can't even remember it, but as soon as I told it, the doors opened and they started to unplug her bed from the wall. And I realized, no, this is the wrong story, because there was a thought that she wasn't going to wake up here, that I was intending for her to come back to this room. But when I was telling the story, I realized this is the wrong story. And then Emily asked me to tell it again. And so I started to tell the story again as we're walking down. Bob is on one side of the bed. I'm on the other. We're walking down the hall. The doctors and nurses are around the bed, pulling it through and pushing it. And I start the whole thing, once upon a time, there was a little caterpillar named Sally. And just asked me to tell this story again. And I told it as we were going through. We got all the way through the hallway into the intensive care unit, into the back of the intensive care unit, where there was just a tiny little room. And the doctor said, okay, now is the time. We just asked the parents to leave. And Bob said, okay, sweetie, I'm going to be right outside. I'm going to be right there. I'm going to come right back as soon as they finish. And he kissed her. And then the doctor looked at me. This is a time we ask parents to leave. And I said, oh, well, I'm staying. And he just kept looking at me. And so we made eye contact, just staring. And he said, well, this is for this procedure, we asked the parents to step out. I said, but we promised Emily that we would always be with her. And so I'm going to stay. And so he just kept making eye contact. And I did too. And then Emily said, Mommy, will you tell me that story again? And I looked around the room. It was just very cramped and counted, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 9 doctors and nurses standing, perched, ready to do the intubation. And I started, once upon a time, there was a little caterpillar named Sally. Sally was very hungry and she started to eat. And as I was looking around the room at each of them, I felt like I was talking to a whole room of kindergartners, like they were all 5-year-olds. And they waited the whole time. It was a very short story, they waited. And when I was finished, Emily looked at me. She has this little system that she did that I had taught her how to relax before they were going to do any kind of procedure, like putting a needle in or something like that. And she would go inside, kind of do a little scan inside and just kind of calm herself down. And then she would nod. So she did that. I could see what she was doing. She was going in and she did a little nod. And I looked at the doctor and said, okay, she's ready. And that was the last story Emily heard as she was conscious. So that was the 18th of April. On the 24th, Bob was in his, right next to Emily. It's his birthday. He's 46 years old. And they had set up that the Ironman lottery people were going to come to deliver the lottery in the hospital. They couldn't come into this isolation room. And instead, they were going to go into the room that they had left for her. So her stem cell transplant room was still there. All the walls covered with cards, and it was filled with people. Everybody knew. Bob had no idea, but everybody, the hospital staff, our friends and family from not from San Diego area. We are not from San Diego, but like everybody knew about this, and they all were in Emily's transplant room while Emily was in the ICU on the day. So this is Bob's birthday. He knows there's a surprise. We didn't tell him what it was, so he knows there's a surprise. And Bob was in the FBI, so FBI LA was in the room, FBI San Diego. I mean, all these people just packed. And so I come into Emily's room. It's April 24th, and I said to Emily, hey, like I talked to her as though she was conscious. Hey, that surprise that you got for Dad for his birthday? Well, I'm going to go give it to him. It's in your transplant room. So I'm going to take Dad down there. We'll be right back. So we left the room or walked down the hall, went to, through all these double doors, get to the transplant corridor. Bob knows something's going on. He pushes the door open. Everybody yells, surprise. And so he's looking around and, oh my gosh, he thinks that's the surprise, which it was the surprise party. And he's just looking around. He has no idea. A couple of minutes later, there's a knock on the door, and this guy with perfect hair comes in. And he said, is Bob Jordan here? And Bob looks over, being a good agent that he is. Yeah, like what prompts the inquiry. But he didn't say that. He said, yes. And he said, you Bob Jordan? Bob said, yes. Are you aware? Oh, no. He goes, did you apply to get into the Hawaii Ironman by lottery? He said, yes. Are you aware of a letter that your daughter wrote? He said, no. So he handed Bob the letter. And Bob takes it and starts reading, "Dear lottery people, my name is Emily. I'm 5 years old. I'm having a transplant to get rid of my leukemia." And as he's reading, like, there's this cameraman behind the guy with the perfect hair who's capturing all of it. And as you look around the room, everybody is filled with emotion, even Bob. And he gets to the part, "I can't leave my isolation room to get my dad a present. Maybe if I write you a letter, you will pick him." And he starts getting really emotional. And the whole room is just like really emotional. And they captured this little story, became a little local news story that became a national news story. And then they asked, would Bob be willing to be featured in the Hawaii Ironman in 1997 as one of those human interest stories.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1997, there he is. He felt like, this is Emily's last gift. So his birthday was on April 24th, and Emily passed away on April 29th, 5 days later. Yeah. And that, it was like the perfect gift from Emily, because that's what Bob did. And he got to Hawaii in 1997, and he felt like, oh my gosh, here I am, this kind of introvert person, and going to be on national TV in my Speedo. It's like, he goes, I'm sure Emily is laughing at this, because it was like the last thing Bob would want. And he wasn't going to agree to do it. As a matter of fact, he asked me to talk to the producer, because he said, I really don't want to do this. I don't want anything to, what's the right word? Kind of like, use Emily's gift in a way that becomes schmaltzy, or like, oh, hey, this is the one about that kid with leukemia. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
really didn't want it to be cheesy. And when I talked to the producer, his name's Al Szymanski, who did the work that year. He had 2 children himself that were about the same age, kind of like as Emily, and his kindness, I could hear it in his voice on the phone, of how he was going to handle it and the ideas, and all along the way just kept on letting us know. They came out to San Diego, where we lived at that time, and basically moved in, got all kinds of footage, and then of course the day of the race. And so that became a documentary kind of thing, like those NBC Ironman documentaries. That really did, it was just, he did such a good job. Really, I don't know how to describe it, like very upbeat and yet very emotional, if that makes sense. Like so much hope and yet so much sadness all mixed together. And, Emily's last gift to her dad. One of the announcers said, at one point said, Bob Jordan, not lucky enough, not good enough. It took a daughter's words to make a father's dream come true. What would you feel if someone did that for you? So in the scene in the film is Bob walking into the water, and as he was watching it, he and I were watching the NBC show together. He said, "Not good enough, not good enough, not good enough." That was in 1997, and in 20 years later, 2017, he qualified on his own. It took him 20 years. But going back to that documentary became this beautiful piece that was nominated for 8 Emmys and won 3. And that piece became an opportunity for these people that wanted to do an Ironman in memory of Emily. So this comes up to, finally, that was a long diversion story, but kind of really powerful for our family. So the folks from Leukemia Society got in touch with us. Would we be willing to let them do the inaugural Iron Team in memory of Emily? Could she be their honor teammate? Would that be okay? And, we weren't in touch with Leukemia and Lymphoma Society at the time. And at that time, it was called Leukemia Society of America. And a couple of people on the team flew us from New Jersey, where we were living. We moved from San Diego to New Jersey. They flew us out to California. And the people on the team did this, and they were doing an Ironman in memory of our daughter. And I had always looked at Bob, say, I could never do that. But here, these are normal people like me and you and probably every listener here, normal people. But they were going to do an Ironman, and they were going to raise money for Team in Training, to raise money for Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And I looked around at these people, I was like, oh my gosh, could I do that? I'd always said I could never do that. And by switching my words, just in a thought, it was in my head, could I do that? I started coming up with all these excuses why I couldn't do it. One is I have a leg length discrepancy. Like one leg is an inch and a half shorter from an old break, my femur years ago. And now my leg is shorter, and I'm like, oh, I can't run. I don't even know. I've never run a marathon. I can't do that. And then I saw somebody doing the Ironman, the full distance Ironman with one leg. I'm like, okay, well, there goes that excuse. Like, I have a leg. It's there. You know what I mean? So, and one by one, all my excuses kept going out the window. Like this, asking the question, could I do that? It became this thing that I couldn't find a really good excuse other than I'd never run a marathon. So this, but it's one step at a time. And I had a whole year to train for it, a whole year. Like if we were to sign up for Cozumel, we have a whole year to train. I'm just saying. But anyway, my first one was very, very slow, and it was in memory of Emily. And so all of the things I do is in memory of Emily, and in others, in honor of people. It's all about Leukemia and Lymphoma Society now. This is my reason for doing it. And I just signed up for another one, A Lava Man. It's going to be in April, and again, to raise money for Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, because it really does matter. Like the money does make a difference. So much more has happened since Emily was diagnosed. When I was on the board of trustees for Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, when we first moved to Oregon, which is where we live now, a woman who was also on the board came up to me and shared that her daughter Emily is here on earth because of my daughter Emily, because what they found out during the trials and the study of my Emily helped her Emily survive. So we just stood there, these two moms in the boardroom, hugging and crying together. And I just felt so grateful. You know what I mean? She shared that. And I know that is true. And there are more and more things that are happening so that, the fact that her name was even Emily, right? Just like, oh,
right.
But anyway, that's where I'm at. The reason I met you, Deborah, is because of menopause. And as I am full on menopause, I'm really afraid of working out so hard to disrupt my hormones, to kind of get things going. So, really appreciative of you for focusing on this so much to really help women who have these imbalances. How do we eat well? How much protein do we really need? And how do we take it, when we're working out and all of that? So I'm so, so grateful that I met you. I feel like this has just been a gift to me, to meet you. And I feel like I have a lot more to learn, a lot more to learn. And and we'll see what the next steps are. But I don't know. Do you have any questions for me?
I do have a couple questions. So I definitely would like to, and I wanted to just let you tell this story without interruption.
Yeah.
But, in our last few minutes, I'd like to, one of the things that you point out that I think to listeners, and listeners, if you're thinking, well, there's no way I have any interest in doing an Ironman, and particularly maybe right now your hormones are wreaking havoc, and you're
Hmm.
hearing me say, go short, go hard when you're ready to go hard. Don't go long anyway. So that would not necessarily be the first exercise prescription I'd give to you, but I do think that listeners can relate to something that you had dropped in when we first talked about. There's resistance, I mean, to many of your friends or acquaintances, for sure, maybe even family members, don't understand the the training and the lifestyle that you're living, and yet these are people you also care about and that care about you. But I think a lot of people, and as we're recording this, it's ironic that it won't be released, but we're recording this right before Thanksgiving. I think when
Yes.
people and emotions get higher, they're near family members, and there's resistance maybe to somebody's lifestyle choices or eating choices, or not wanting to eat what's there or wanting to have something different. And there's resistance always when, first of all, our own internal resistance to, as you mentioned, I can't ever do that, or
Right.
can I do that?
Right.
There's that. But then there's the, once you've decided, I mean, that doesn't necessarily flip your switch and say, because you've chosen it, that you won't resist it sometimes.
Right.
And then there's the external resistance. So how have you handled that, as people, maybe all of your family and friends, look at you like you're crazy, like, what are you doing? Why would you do that?
Yeah, well, it is pretty crazy. So I'm not. I feel like it is kind of like on the lunatic fringe, but it does work for our family. So I just want to say that, and there's something about finding happiness and joy,
Hmm.
and what is it that you do that brings that, and we have that. So we are finding that, and people make different choices all the time. Like without any so whatever choice you make is totally fine. And in terms of eating or exercising, kind of like that line, stay in your own lane. Just do what, as my sister would say, you do you. Like when
Hmm.
I visited her, I was eating very different, and it was totally fine. She was like, "Oh, no problem. Just you do you." And so it wasn't an issue. It was a non thing that I had kind of thought about ahead of time. Maybe it's going to be challenging. It wasn't even at all, not even a little bit. And this was at a time when I was, strictly vegetarian. Now I'm eating meat, and the reason I have welcomed that, and it was a very hard decision because I love animals so much, and I've seen factory farming issues. It's just horrible. So I'm really, really careful about the humane treatment of the animals and all of this other stuff. But I couldn't get enough protein. I didn't realize how much I needed, first of all, but I couldn't get enough, or at least it didn't feel like I was getting enough, especially when I'm adding weight training in. So with the weight training, I definitely am much more hyper aware of how much protein I'm getting in and wanting to get a lot more. And then having the meat sources available is just a lot easier. And I do go back and forth with this emotionally, though. I will say that. So I do a lot of blessing and thanking and gratitude. Think of gratitude. Oh my gosh, so grateful for the farmers that take such good care and sustaining ways to care for their animals and the way they treat them. So I choose those places. But that being said, it has been so much easier for protein.
Love that. And that actually was a question I also wanted to ask you, because being an endurance athlete, being a woman in her 60s, there is the concern of, how you are going to, meet those nutrition needs and refuel,
Yep.
refire, repair, and all the
Yes.
things that you want to do. Kind of, if we take every listener out there who's not training for an endurance event, it's still true of you as well. And
Yes.
then you layer the endurance on top of it, and there's that. So glad that you mentioned that. And I think with respect, so try to come I try to come from a no judgment zone, simply
Yes.
the message being to all of you that we do need to be consciously aware of protein needs, the research about getting essential amino acids, and you can do it plant-based, but you've just got to be excruciatingly more conscious of how you're combining those foods so that you get all those essential amino acids, and it becomes a volume issue really, to be able to eat it all and combine it all in the right amounts without getting over full or over, for some who might be more carb sensitive in midlife than they were earlier. And in almost every plant source of protein being carbohydrate, that can be a dual edged sword. On one
Yeah.
hand, this, but on the other hand, that. So
Right.
great. I love that. And I would love to tell listeners, you shared with us such a beautiful story. And obviously, no one here has to ask you, what's your why, right? We're totally understanding of it. And so inspirational. I think one of the unspoken things here is that the human body is so capable, so much more capable of things beyond what we accept to be normal or true and or average, and the ability to be more resilient. And you mentioned joy, right? And the lifestyle that you're living. And I think to every endurance athlete out there, self included, I do think
Mhm.
there is hormone balancing exercise prescription, and then there is, and we can't though rob you of joy. We've got to
Mhm.
find a sweet spot for you to love what you're doing, love your lifestyle, and there may be a time when you've got to hold yourself back, but there may also be a way to dance the dance so that we can compensate for what it is you do want to do.
Mhm.
But I love so much of what you've shared, and I would love if there is a place where listeners who are inclined could go and learn more about fundraising and or racing. What would
Mm.
that URL be?
Yeah, so if people wanted to, go to Team in Training, that's probably the way to do it,
Okay.
Team in Training.
Okay.
The
And then
Leukemia
you,
and Lymphoma Society is the
yep. And I don't know that we've talked about this, but I did my first triathlon or I mean, my first marathon, I'm sorry, was with Team in Training
Oh, wow, that's so
in
cool.
in Toronto. Yeah, it
Wow,
was.
wow.
And then I turned around and became a coach, and we did Disney, I think
Oh
was
my
the
gosh.
second one. Yeah.
Whoa, that's a crazy one. Yep, wow. So the first
Yes.
one with Team in Training was Ironman USA, which they don't even have anymore, but it's now Lake Placid. But it was the
Mm.
first Ironman in the contiguous United States, back in 1999. That was my first Ironman, my first marathon, my first Team in Training event.
Okay. And then I want listeners to stay tuned because I've suggested to Terry that maybe we should do Cozumel next year together.
So
She
here's
hasn't
the
said
thing.
no
I
yet.
haven't said no, but you know what? Part of it is that it's the same day as Ironman Arizona.
Is Bob doing it again? Or
Oh,
you?
yeah, of course. I mean,
Bob
he
is.
has to
Okay.
defend his title.
Well, you could be down in Cozumel and say, look, honey, my swim is going to be 30 some degrees warmer than yours. Have a good time there.
Yeah, he hasn't signed up yet. So yeah, I don't know. It's just this is a tough one. We have done a lot of talking about it. We'll have to talk more. Yeah, we did a lot of talking this whole past week because we were in Arizona, of course. So we were talking about
Yeah.
Cozumel a lot. just because you planted the seed. I would not have talked about it
Right.
if it wasn't for you.
Well, you should have seen me. So I'm sure you were running around all day Sunday. I was on the couch, but I was clicking to Ironman Arizona watching Bob, and I was clicking to the tracker at Cozumel
So
watching
fun.
another
Yeah.
friend or two.
Oh,
And I'm
that's
like,
so
oh my
fun.
God, this is so fun. And I have fear of missing out right now.
Oh. I love it. I love it.
So, Terry, thank you again so much for being here. Thanks for honoring us by telling your story.
Oh, I feel like I went on a little too long, and feel free to edit, cut some of that, or it's
We're
too long.
not
Yeah.
cutting a
Oh my
thing.
gosh.
And so,
Couldn't even
listeners,
remember the
this
opening.
has either been two commutes or it's been a really long walk, and it's been worth it. And I hope you'll agree. So, hug
Oh.
your kids a little bit tighter today. And
Mhm.
if you have a question or you have a sentiment that you'd like to share with Terry, you can leave that below the show notes, and that'll be at flipping50.com/triathlon training.
Ooh, cool. And I'm working on a website. It's called doingitforemily.com. It's kind of like in progress and process, but you can see a picture of Emily and Bob, and it's kind of, there's some other little things you can take a look around. Doingitforemily.com.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you,
Okay.
Deborah. Thank you for what you do in the world, the work that you do, and really helping. You've helped me so much. Just I'm really grateful that I met you. So thank you.
You're so welcome. All right, listeners, what are you waiting for? Let's start flipping 50 today.